Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into Karl Marx, specifically this idea of social labor. It's a concept that's key to, I think, his whole critique of capitalism. And we've got a stack of his writings here to help us unpack it all. We've got excerpts from Grundrisse, all sorts of good stuff.
Yeah, it's one of those terms that can feel a bit abstract, but once you grasp what he's getting at with it, it really does change how you see the whole economic system, like, functioning around you.
Okay, so let's start simple then. What does Marx even mean by social labor? In the first place, I feel like we throw the word labor around a lot, but he's got something very specific in mind, right?
Yeah, he does. You're right. We do use labor in all kinds of ways, but Marx is getting at how our individual efforts, our individual work, kind of fits into this bigger picture of production, the system of production as a whole. Think of it like this. You might spend all day baking amazing cakes, right? That's your individual labor. But those cakes become socially labored when they're out in the world, when they're sold, when they're bought, consumed. They're part of this whole economic flow now.
So it's not just about, like, the act of working, but how that work is connected to all the other work that everyone else is doing.
Exactly. And Marx has, this great quote in Grundrisse that really gets at the heart of this. He says, and stick with me here, it's a bit of a dense one.
Okay.
The social character of activity, as well as the social form of the product, and the share of individuals in production here appear as something alien and objective, confronting the individuals not as their relation to one another, but as their subordination to relations which subsist independently of them and which arise out of collisions between mutually indifferent individuals.
Oh, okay, that's a mouthful. Even for a deep dive, that's deep. Can we maybe break that down a little bit? What's he actually saying there?
He's essentially highlighting how under capitalism, the way we work and the things that we produce, they end up kind of shaping us rather than the other way around. So we relate to our work as this separate thing outside of ourselves, even though it's the combined effort of, everyone that actually makes the whole system function.
So it's like we see ourselves as just doing our job. But our job is only a job because it's like part of this massive web that we don't always see or even understand.
Precisely. It's, let's use an analogy. Imagine a city, right?
Okay.
A bustling city, tons of people, everyone doing their own thing, working, shopping, commuting. On the surface, it looks like a bunch of separate actions, but they're all interlinked. That city only works because of that combined effort, that social labor. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm starting to get the picture here. But how does this social labor idea connect to other things that Marx talks about, like surplus labor? Aren't they kind of two sides of the same coin?
They are definitely related, yeah. Think of it this way. Social labor is the overall system, the web connecting everyone's work, right? Surplus labor is more about that specific way that overall system generates profit. So it's the portion of your work that goes beyond what you would need just to survive. And that extra bit is where the capitalist makes their money.
Okay, so it's like I need to work X number of hours to afford my rent and my food, but I'm actually working, X plus 5 hours.
Yeah.
And those extra 5, that's the surplus, and that's what someone else is profiting from.
You got it. And Marx would argue that's a major point of tension within the whole system of capitalism, because that surplus value is coming from the worker, from their effort, their time. But it's the owner who's actually benefiting the most from it.
Man, this is really giving me a whole new lens to look at, work and even just participating in the economy. This is wild.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down that road, let's take a quick pause so that everyone can kind of absorb what we've talked about.
Yeah.
Catch their breath.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got a lot more to unpack here, including how this all actually plays out in the real world. But we'll get to that in just a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, so we've laid some groundwork here with this whole, idea of social labor, how it's different from just individual work, and how it ties into that surplus value concept. But I'm curious, where do we go from here? How does all this actually function, beyond just dictionary definitions?
Well, if we're going to move beyond just definitions, then I think we have to talk about how social labor actually functions in a system like capitalism. And for Marx, a really big part of that is exchange. Remember how we were saying earlier, it's not enough to just make something. It has to be brought into that bigger web of, economic activity.
Right. Like my hypothetical cakes from before.
Yeah.
They're only truly socially labored once they're out in the world being bought and sold and all that.
Exactly. It's the market that makes that connection happen. When goods and services are exchanged, that's how individual labor is actually validated by society. It becomes, how do you say it? socially necessary because it's contributing to that whole circulation of commodities and value within the entire capitalist system.
Okay, so I'm seeing how this all ties together now. But doesn't that kind of create this weird disconnect? Like we're just reducing everything to its market value?
Yeah.
What about the actual skill and creativity that people put into their work? Does that just disappear?
You're hitting on a key point there. Marx would argue that is a huge problem with capitalism. He saw it as a form of alienation. Like the worker becomes separated from the fruits of their labor. Their individual talents and passions kind of become secondary to the demands of the market.
Right.
He called this process commodity fetishism.
Okay.
Basically, we become so focused on the exchange value of things that we totally forget about, like the human element, the human labor that went into actually producing them.
So it's like we're all just cogs in this giant machine, just churning out products for the sake of the market rather than for any sort of personal fulfillment or creative expression or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that alienation, that separation from our work and from each other, it's a big part of why Marx was so critical of capitalism, right? He felt like it was preventing us from really reaching our full potential, both as individuals and as, a society as a whole.
Well, that's some pretty heavy stuff. So is there any way out of this whole system of social labor and alienation, according to Marx, or are we all just kind of stuck in this cycle forever?
That's the big question, right? And it's one that Marx dedicated a lot of thought to. But for him, understanding these concepts, social labor, alienation, surplus value, that was a necessary first step. He believed that by actually seeing how the system works, by recognizing, how these things are all intertwined, then we could start to actually imagine and work towards a more just and equitable society,
Yeah.
one that wasn't based on this kind of exploitation.
So knowledge is power, as they say.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's back up for a second here. We talked about social labor, we talked about alienation, but what about surplus labor? Where does that fit into this whole big picture? We touched on it a bit earlier, but I'm still not 100% clear on how it all connects.
Right. So it's all about the value that's being created, right? Remember, surplus labor is that portion of your work that goes above and beyond what you actually need just to survive. It's the extra that the capitalist gets to keep.
Right. Like the X plus 5 hours, in my example earlier.
Yeah.
But why is that so important? Is it just about the money?
It's about more than just the money, yeah. It's about power. Marx saw surplus labor as the source of the capitalist power. It's how they're able to actually accumulate wealth and then, maintain their position within the system.
So it's not just about individual workers being exploited. It's about how that exploitation is maintaining this whole power structure, this whole hierarchy.
Exactly. And remember that quote we talked about earlier from Grundrisse? This ties directly into that. The worker is subordinated to the system, to those relations of production, and surplus labor is a huge part of how that subordination is actually maintained.
Man, this is definitely making me think about the world in a whole new way. What about you out there listening? Are you starting to see these connections too? It's wild stuff.
I'd love to hear what's standing out for you. But before we move on, I think it's important to actually look at some concrete examples, how social labor actually plays out in different industries. I think that might help to make things even clearer.
Yeah, let's get specific. Okay, so we've been getting pretty theoretical with all this. I'm ready to see how this stuff actually plays out in real life. What kind of industries would you say really highlight this whole social labor thing?
Well, let's think about something that most people interact with every day. Something simple, the food industry.
Okay.
You imagine a farmer out there growing wheat, right?
Right.
That's individual labor at that point. It's their effort, their time. But then what happens?
Well, I mean, that wheat gets harvested, it gets processed, it's turned into flour, goes to a bakery, it's made into bread, shipped to the stores, ends up in my shopping cart.
Exactly. That whole chain, right, from field to table. That's social labor in action. You have all these different people. Each person is kind of doing their specific task, but it's all interconnected, contributing to that final product that we all consume.
And I'm guessing somewhere along that line, surplus labor is happening too, right? Someone's making a profit off of, my bread.
Absolutely. I mean, think of all the people involved, right? You've got the farm workers, the truck drivers, factory workers, bakers, the cashiers at the store. The list goes on and on. Each of them is contributing labor, and some portion of that labor is generating that surplus value, which ultimately ends up, in the pockets of the owners, the investors, the folks at the top.
Yeah. I guess that's why Marx was so concerned about like the exploitation that's inherent in this system. It's not just about, one bad apple. It's
Yeah.
baked into like the whole structure of how things operate.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, he saw social labor as kind of like this invisible web, It connects all of us, but within that web there's this inherent tension between those who, own the means of production, the factories, the land, or whatever, and those who are doing the actual work, the actual producing.
So it's not just about understanding like how things are made, but it's about understanding those power dynamics that are like at play underneath it all.
Exactly. And recognizing our own roles within that system, right? Like as consumers, our choices, what we buy, where we shop, how much we're willing to pay, it all has an impact on the lives of the workers who are part of that whole chain of social labor.
Man, this has been incredibly eye-opening. It makes you realize that even just something as simple as like buying a loaf of bread is connected to all these much bigger issues, of labor and value and exploitation.
And that's the power of, Marx's analysis. He gives us this framework for understanding these complexities and for asking those critical questions about the systems that we live in.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on social labor, is there like a key takeaway that you would want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is just to start seeing those connections, Next time you buy something, just take a second. Think about all the labor that went into it, like the whole entire chain of social labor that made it possible. And then just ask yourself who benefits the most from that system.
Wow, that's a powerful thought to end on. Really challenges you to like be more aware. So to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.